I'm sure Dee, a long time ago, said, I want my name on it.
So we're live.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the November meeting of the Albany Port District Commission. My name is Georgette Steffens, and I'm the chair, and we'll go around the room and introduce ourselves.
Joe Coffey, Commissioner.
Dominic Tagliano, Commissioner.
Richard Hendrick, CEO.
Christine Studo, CFO.
Lynn Zaranda, CFO for hire.
Megan Daly, Director of Economic Development and Procurement for the court.
Jim Teller, Security.
Dave Williams, Security.
Bill Ring, Federal Marine Terminals.
Tony Vassal, Maritime Business Development Manager.
Patrick Jordan, General Counsel.
All right, thank you. So in your packets, I know ahead of time everyone has received a copy of the minutes. I know I have a few notes that I'll talk to Pat about in the second paragraph. They're really more grammatical than they don't change the substance of the minutes. But does anyone else have any comments or edits or changes to the minutes?
No.
If not, I'll ask for a motion to approve pending just a few minor changes.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you very much. All right, so we just held a governance committee meeting prior to this meeting where we reviewed, the committee has been given a copy of the committee assignments as well as the sort of charter of the committees, and we'll have an opportunity to review those and then enact on them or to approve them at the next board meeting, as well as we reviewed the 2020 dates, and so those will be posted on our website as well. Is there anything else that should be noted about what was discussed in the governance committee?
No, we'll have the first governance meeting next year will be before the January board meeting, and we'll further discuss the general requirements that need to be reported to the state through the Paris reporting system.
Are we distributing board evaluation forms?
Yes.
And they'll be reviewed in January at that time. All right, so I will turn it over to Christine for our monthly financial update.
Okay, for the month of October, we were in line where we've been for the whole second half of the year. We're slightly down in our change in net position. The difference is $35,000 decrease in revenue. That is because we had a liquid fertilizer come in September. And year to date, we are projecting a consistent year-end change in net position, about $308,000 negative. Our changes to the forecast were a slight decrease in the revenues and a slight increase in expenses as well. So we think we are consistent with where we forecasted, and in the next couple of months we will compare our year-end forecast to where we budgeted to see if there's any changes that we need to make before we start the new year.
So sort of looking at what you have here and looking at next year's budget.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any comments?
No, just that the forecast that we had reworked a number of months ago has been holding very close to that over the past number of months, and we expect it to hold close through the end of this fiscal year. And as noted, you know, we're having regular meetings with people like Bill and Tony to review their reporting and their information and percentages of opportunities, I guess I should say, and how they can work into the forecast.
Any specific questions on the October financial report?
Thank you very much. All right, Rich.
Thank you. First of all, it's It's been a very hectic month. We've been in Boston twice for invitations from the offshore wind industry. The second visit was an invitation from General Electric to participate in the unveiling of their offshore wind blade, which is about the largest in the world. Pat and I were able to go over and be part of the ceremony for that blade. It bodes well with the work that we're doing, gearing our expansion towards the offshore wind industry. And you know, it should be noted publicly the yeoman's work that is being undertaken by Megan. You know, when I review the weekly timesheets, I see that she's spending 74 to 80 hours a week on our grant applications and all the behind the scenes work that is going on. It's just we wouldn't be where we are today if it wasn't for the dedication that she has put into this expansion project. On November 4th, we had Senator Schumer here. He came to do a review of the Tiger projects that have been ongoing for the last 2 years, and he commented that one of the reporters that was there asked, well, you know, you supported this for a $50 million all-in Tiger grant. What do you think? And he says, I think it's great that we gave them this money 3 years ago, and look at how much is already in place. And it was nice because he was here on the 4th, and the final piece of equipment was removed. I think on the 1st of November, the dock has been inspected by our engineering firm Moffett Nickel, and has been approved. All of the final paperwork with the state and everything is in, so we should be good to go with our soon to be used ro-ro ramp and the dock.
I thought it was great to have the Albany City, the county, and Bethlehem there as well, and the support that was expressed for both that project and our expansion project, as well as Schumer's support for future phases, which he was very clear that he was supporting future phases for us and for our growth here. So I think that speaks well, the ability, like you're saying, to not everyone can really, it's one thing to get the money, it's another thing to move through the permitting process and execute and deliver, and we delivered quickly given the constraints that we have, and I think it shows our ability for that next round, right? That we're not just going to get the money and sit on it, and I think that is helpful.
Yeah, it was a pleasant surprise to hear the senator speak in favor of the $24+ million grant that we have in for infrastructure on the new land in Bethlehem, and that I don't want to jinx it, but the last time he was here supporting the Tiger grant, it happened to be, and he's fully supporting the work we're doing towards offshore wind development in our new land, and I'm very hopeful that in the near future that federal grant will come through on that. We've had several progress meetings with the legal counsel and Sims Metal Management, where I think we're moving towards final resolution of the cleanup of the property at 700 Smith Boulevard. We expect, and I've said this before, in the very near future, that we'll have everything approved with the EPA and New York State DEC, and we'll be moving towards putting that property back on our rent rolls. The demolition of 801 Smith Boulevard is about 95% complete. There's a memo that's in your packets describing where we were with that. Are there any questions that?
It's not in there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I came right from that
Oh,
thing straight up,
okay.
so I'll copy an email.
All right, well, we don't have the full engineer's report on the demolition and the full bills. We had planned to have that for you, but it's running a day or so behind. But the payment resolution will be in for the December meeting. And then our property expansion, we'll discuss, I guess, in other business, or,
We can discuss that a little bit in the next item.
okay. Yeah, we'll do the expansion work on
Yeah.
our real property.
I do want to say, I know Joe and I were there at the Capitalize Albany annual meeting, and Megan served on the panel. And I really appreciate, I think, the timing of the panel, and then there was an article about the offshore wind, and I really appreciate how you guys just keep on coming back to the economic impact of what we're doing, and, you know, continuing to show our growth, our priority is having an economic impact in the region with jobs and, you know, the general, you know, supply chain and things that can happen from the growth there. So I thought the way both of you handled that article, or response in the article, and was it the Times Union maybe? I don't remember which one, but about the cost of.
Well, and we had WNYT was here and
Oh,
asking
that's what
about
it
it,
was.
and it was coupled with NYSERDA, which was a nice partnership. And then actually we've had Spectrum News 9 has also looked at the board in the past couple of days and asked for that economic impact information as well. And I appreciate that point. I actually carry around that economic impact report because we had to do that for the fiscal impacts too with the seeker process for the town of Bethlehem. That, you know, report was in that list of work that was done. And it really is notable, the level of economic impact of expanding in general, which, you know, goes all the way back to the, you know, the Berger and Nathan recommendation on growth. That growth in general can bring an economic impact of $200 to $300 million annually. But when you add the wind industry, it really does add just a significant level of increase to that, to over $400 million potential for economic impact on an annual basis.
So it almost triples the number of jobs, right?
Exactly. Yeah, the jobs go from potential of 600 to 900 to over 1,600. And what's interesting is their model was to look at it from an Albany County impact, the town and the county, versus the port-wide. We have looked at statewide before, so we, you know, only can imagine the statewide impact as well. But we do know that that's part of the talking points too that NYSERDA included with the Spectrum conversation, was their overall market potential with the offshore wind was in the billions, and the jobs were in the thousands. So it shows how it's contributing to that work too. So
Yeah, no,
I
sorry.
think there's two other takeaways. I was looking at it a little bit more broad sense. And I look at it more from the perspective as a board member where we were 3 years ago. And the things that we're celebrating now are really the fruits of the planning process that was started earlier. Having a strategy, having a goal, having a strategic plan that focused on what our opportunities were, and thinking of it as support, but the part of a more regional economy. So I think we're benefiting from that process and the patience that we had and the suffering that we went through, sitting around the table looking at what the things were that we thought were strategic opportunities at the time.
well, and I think sometimes as staff, we test ourselves against that. We test ourselves against the strategic recommendations that were made and what's being fulfilled or how. And in fact, we still have conversations. This weekend, we had a conversation with Paul Kent over some of the stuff. So it's still the basis. I think that's a good point, and that was a good recommendation.
You gotta work the plan, you know, and if the plan's wrong, we'll see that at some point. to make a correction.
Yeah.
It's one of the few binders that actually keep, where I can actually reach it. The other ones are in drawers and in closets. But I think, I look back and I think that was a worthwhile exercise.
Yeah, I agree, we agree. And I think they agree as well, which for me at least is unique to have consultants come back and check in, or say they see this news and how it's fulfilling and the work that we're doing. But so, I appreciate that. Should I go on in terms of the real property update? As an update from our last board meeting, we did mention how the final GEIS was submitted to the town of Bethlehem. They actually, and I'm looking at Pat for the language on this, they actually initiated a supplemental final GEIS component that they're asking us to do an additional citizen participation plan. That will hold another public meeting. This time we'll do it at the Housing Authority. We'll do some outreach related to South End community, and we'll do that, specifically in the neighborhood. We talked to the Housing Authority about holding it right at the same location where DST recently had a meeting, so that likely based on seeker law timing requirements, if I'm saying this right, probably will happen the first week of January.
The one thing I like too, when Senator Schumer was here and the local electeds talked about it, was the fact that we have been listening and engaging with the folks here in the South End, the transportation and routing the traffic through the port as part of our longer plan. I think the fact that that was acknowledged by everyone was a positive.
We hope as a staff level, we're hoping that that public meeting in January can be a good dialogue at a public level, even though this is still at a generic level with the seeker process. We were wanting to go specifically to that community when there's more of a specific project to say specific impact, but we think that we can give it all in context in that, with the team and with the reporting that we've been doing at the town level, we can give the context.
Are you meeting with Derek Johnson and Joanne Morton and others in the Southland community in advance of that meeting to kind of prep and get some alignment on that?
We will be. We're trying to schedule a date. Excuse me, we're actually waiting, and last night did they come up with the final dates where the public meeting would be?
They've accepted they've commented a little bit on that plan of the public meeting would be January 6th.
They being
the town of Bethlehem.
Planning board for Bethlehem. We met, we were in the meeting with Derek Johnson with the air quality reporting 2 weeks ago, and Rich and I had spoken with him a few months before that. We will be reaching out ahead of that. The next step, and Dorsey clears as well. She and I have talked about this over the last couple of years. So they're informed, but yes, we'll get more information to them ahead of that meeting.
So in terms of our timeline on our approvals for the expansion, that adds a little bit of time. And I think the planning board has recognized that adds to our time, and that is making us a little concerned in terms of achieving goals for the industry that we're trying to attract here with the offshore wind. But I think it can still work, and I think it can be done in a way that serves all. We're hoping that the final approval based on the schedule that we provided would be in February.
I'm just kind of thinking, usually this is where my mouth gets ahead of my brain, which I hate to say that on a public it's common knowledge. Are the things that we can be doing to advance the timeline that aren't getting too far, the cart too far ahead of the horse?
Yeah.
But it's not delaying what we're trying to do?
Yes, and I think that's a good point related to the proposal that we have related. The next item. I think this is something to be mindful of this, and then also the RFQ that we have out to the public for wharf design.
So you can still do that solicitation.
Yes.
And you're not making any active decision, but the process
you're
is
not
still
committing.
advancing. So
Yes.
you're not really jeopardizing too much or.
Yes, that, agreed, and I think the activity related to both the proposal and the RFQ we put out there shows credibility to the business development conversations that we're having too, where we're showing schedules on what needs to be done to achieve different milestones and that we're taking different steps. I think it's still possible to take different steps in a parallel path with achieving commitments from business investment. There was another thing I was going to make on that point.
I guess what I'm thinking, you know, the extra step in the community engagement doesn't really delay, shouldn't really delay or push back too much the first front-end steps that we can do on some of the other work.
Well, I think so too. I think that there's a good way to do the parallel path, and I think that's part of a potential value of having the team, you know, with a proposal that's under, you know, item 6.
Can I ask you a question before we go into that?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. So I know a lot of the conversation has been around how can we better align the Port Road and the railroads and all of that, like in order to try to get more of the traffic coming through here versus going out onto Pearl Street and such. And what are the next steps in, like, obviously I'm assuming it's a pretty significant, you need some designation, you need some funding, like what are those pieces and how are we moving those forward and who?
So the redesignation has occurred. That was successful with CTC last year, so that the roads in the port are now eligible for federal funding, which is your first big step.
So is that then you get on the list for
We
the
can
tip?
we can either get on a tip list, or we can just simply apply for other funding revenue sources through federal DOT. And one of the biggest issues is happening right now. When Greco and the 801 comes down, that enables us to straighten the road. That's 20% of the problem.
Right.
Trucks cannot navigate that area of the port. Then in the future, with the expansion and with new buildings coming out online inside, you know, we're in the traditional port area and the 80 acres, those trucks through leases, through signage will be directed through the port internal roads, either up through Church on the 787 or out through the south and then up Corning Hill. That's going to be a significant amount of work and steps, and that's what the planning board wants and other agencies want. Obviously, the mayor is pushing that for a couple of years, that we've agreed with that. Getting trucks off of Pearl End is a further discussion with state DOT and the city on how to do that. We'll do the best that we can to upgrade the roads.
What are we really, like, how much is it, and, you know, do we have capacity for it, or do we need to be asking all the other people that are part of this conversation to be advocating on our
Yes.
behalf for funding, like, and are we doing that?
We have started those conversations started in theory years ago, but
Yeah.
they've started in more earnest. We met with city traffic engineers and city planning department just last week
Okay.
to push exactly that. And it would have to be a partnership of some type. I don't think, just speaking for myself, we could take this all on our own. We would certainly need the cities and counties and maybe the states, you know, yeah, exactly.
Well,
Okay on funding sources, or signing off on our ask for funding sources.
And you've gotten that commitment at the public meetings when
Right.
DEC had their air quality press event at, actually held at Ezra. The mayor, the county executive, and state DOT were in the gaggle, and they all committed to help with that. CDTC did a transportation assessment following ours, and the last year they estimated the cost in engineering to improve the roadways was between $13 and $18 million. A good part of that is a portion, a segment of the work that would be done for that plan is going to be started next year on the Smith Boulevard. That is funded with federal funding because it's an external pathway for us for the big lift. So we're taking the lead and initiative on that portion of the work. As you know, the port had submitted a DOT funding to do all of the roads last year through a port and rail infrastructure program, and it was not successful. Some of the feedback we got was that it might be better served if there were other partnering applicants. We took that to mean that if the city applied, it might be more successful.
Mhm. So is that an open, like, apply, or is there like an annual?
Annual, and we understand that won't open again until 2020.
Thank you.
Thank you. But going back to the planning process, I just wanted to say a couple other updates on that. So we did issue that RFQ for the wharf design. That it was an RFQ, so that would be responses are due later this week. The intent would be that we would have those responses, perhaps form a committee to review those and do interviews, or a next step to invite a further proposal. So that's not cost, that's qualifications. That's critical because in this offshore wind, which is the only reason the wharf would be needed in that case, has a very specific depth of knowledge that would be required. So that's the first cut there. We also have an additional non-disclosure agreement that the port has signed with another wind-related company to be able to have earnest interaction on site designs for the expansion property, as well as, quite frankly, 700 Smith Boulevard. There's interest in that property, so the timing of this is very good. And then, as Rich mentioned, we did submit, NYSERDA had opened up a first round of port infrastructure funding RFQ. So what that was is that everybody could submit what the plan would be, what partners could potentially look like, what a site could be potentially used for, and so the Port of Albany submitted that response. On Friday, it was submitted as a confidential response because it provided, and the program did allow that, because it did provide some level of specificity on the uses, but the overall intent was developing the site for offshore wind supply chain, specifically related to manufacturing activity. And I would say we had 5 letters of support from the offshore wind supply chain, the private side, as well as we had a letter of support from the town of Bethlehem and from the Center for Economic Growth. Our expectation is that the next stage is NYSERDA will then invite groups to respond to a next level and get more specific on funding and needs. We expect that will be in early 2020. And then I think the last thing I would transition over to the item 6, if that's fine. So item 6 is was something that was provided to the board in advance. It was a proposal that we had requested from the team from McFarland Johnson, who has been doing the permitting, the seeker, the generic environmental impact work for the expansion. The reason to ask for a specific proposal on this set of activity was because most of this activity is intended for preparation of development work at that expansion site, regardless of what the end use was. Meaning, if it was offshore wind, if it was Costco, which it's not. It's not. Just saying, if it's not offshore wind, this type of work would be necessary and would advance the port and the activity. The only part of that work that's very specific is how they would engage with a technical expert on the wharf. It's believed that having a local technical company with experience and success in permitting that receives some technical input from wharf design companies would be more successful in the permitting. So what I'm not going to go through it too much, but what the proposal was internal roadways, bridge, permitting, and it would include the infrastructure and utility work to prepare the site for building. There is a resolution that's provided with it. The intention of the resolution was to give a bit of a guideline on the background of where we came to get to this level, as well as justification for the approach on this. In our procurement guidelines, the port does have the ability to do waiver of competition or professional services if there are certain benefits, and that's included in the resolution. The language is outlined there in terms of continuity of information, continuity of service. That is one of the biggest reasons, as well as the team's good work to date. I think I'll open it for questions if that sounds like a good approach.
I spoke my piece last night.
You went through their list of assumptions and felt like you were in agreement or okay with the assumptions that they made?
I think it's scope, right?
You do.
Okay.
It's
He said he
great.
thought it was scoped.
I think it was scoped correctly for what we're asking.
Okay.
And Megan was kind enough to answer some of the questions that I had about really more what you addressed here, sort of the timing of, the town's approval, the wharf stuff. And I think we did talk at the last meeting a little bit about, really needing to make sure that we're not slowing down anything, and that a lot of these things are items that will need to be done regardless of the end use on the site.
One thing I wanted to note was in one of the last two recent conversations and meeting with the town, they've actually specifically asked us, so we have a schedule with them to get us through this final elements of the final environmental impact statement. But then they've also asked us, on the heels of this, when would we expect you to do the next level of permit applications? So that was a good sign to us of they're also looking ahead and looking to see the project in general and the scoping of that. The other thing that I thought was positive was the town supervisor offered and provided a letter of support for the NYSERDA application. And it continues to be that, I think, very eloquent language that he used at the wharf, the RoRo with the senator, of the value of the industry and the value of the impact to the town.
Does anyone have any specific
There was
questions?
one other thing, I'm sorry, that based off of your questions and your suggestions that I thought it was good, was that the permitting component related to the wharf is not the first thing that will be done. It will be in the first half, but not in the very beginning. If there was a question or a concern related to tying that to an actual need for a wharf, we could include in the language of the contract language to tie it to either milestones of a business need, such as an intent from a company or an obligation from a company, or a lease, which in terms of timing, I think, I'm going to be a little careful here on the specificity, but I think our next level of engagement with businesses that we've provided proposals to on the expansion will likely be in the first quarter of 2020, that we would get some level of next level of, I'm not going to say commitment, intent, it's in that vein, and then before summer we would have a commitment.
So what are you saying?
One of the questions that you had asked was,
I had a couple questions. One was, what if we didn't move forward with solar, right? It sounds like we would, sorry. Alternative energy, sorry.
Now we're doing something totally
completely
different.
We've only been talking about wind for months now. Would we want to make sure, we wouldn't really move forward with the wharf piece, and making sure that we're not moving too far ahead in committed funds towards projects that they want to make sure that we're being intentional with how we're spending the money and not just prospectively, you know, going out, but that being, you know, responsible on that money.
So you were saying you can take this, but it can be goal or phase oriented
Well,
even within this?
If you look at the breakdown of the different tiers
Yeah,
of the
they
work
do.
that would be proposed, in the permitting part, the permitting covers the entire site, but it also includes a portion that's related to the wharf.
We can ask them to take their general scope and the way they've got this, and go back and look at the schedule and the fee. We can ask them to break that out a little bit more to subtask the permitting, and then no particular subtask proceeds without express authorization from the court.
Okay, much better said, yes.
And I think that's what,
Yes.
break the permitting down,
Yeah,
you know, to the different elements, like when you look at, their schedule,
yeah.
you know, they got some different elements in there. Maybe we just need to break the permitting, not by task, specifically what it's for.
Okay,
And I think they can do that. I still had a little trouble doing the math on their MWBE thing. I couldn't kind of figure that out.
Where they were coming up with the 13.
Yeah, I don't know how they got to 13 and a half. Looked a little light to me, but.
so it's a good point. Even achieving the 13% was very deliberate how they pursued that. Specifically related to like the geotech work. So there was specifically partnering with the geotech, which I think the MWBE was influencing that decision.
Normally does. But I just, if you're going to commit to it, do it, you know. And then the other thing is, I'd like to see an appendix with their proposal that just has the hourly rates for the individuals that are assigned to the project, since all this work is lump sum.
Okay.
Kind of gives you an idea of who's working on what.
Yeah.
And in the event that we do have some particular element of work that might be authorized outside what they're looking at, we want to pursue it, I'd like to kind of get some commitment on the hourly rates up front. And it's not something that's atypical. I think most consultants would expect to provide that even as part of a lump sum contract.
Sure, we've done that.
Yeah.
I'm actually wondering if they believe they had provided that in an earlier engagement, and might be why they didn't do it here, but we will do that.
Trust but verify.
Okay.
And so the other thing that, so the other thing we talked about was where the money was coming from, and because we haven't budgeted this, right, in the 2020 budget.
So I'm going to speak before, if you don't mind. So part of it was forecasted in terms of consulting work, and part of it, in the entire work, is something that is what, that port infrastructure grant that we applied for, and soft costs are
And what-
covered.
Did we actually receive 5 million for the
So that's really,
80
that's very
expansion?
keen that you identify that. So we do have a $5 million commitment on that expansion that we don't have a contract on yet, because we had been sort of directed of have a business in place to do that. But we've had even recent conversations with them about, you know, our progress and what we're doing, and is now a time to come back to that.
Because I would assume you can't start the work and not get paid, right? Like they would.
For that particular, yeah,
Yeah.
right.
So I guess those conversations.
And
would
that
need to be-
$5 million actually, I would not expect would cover this.
You don't think?
It's the
Okay.
federal
Yeah.
infrastructure one that would, and it's in fact the federal infrastructure that would cover the cost of constructing most of this.
But so if we're gonna start, let's say we hire them, they start January 1 or whenever, sometime in December, but we haven't gotten the grant funds yet, this work probably won't be grant reimbursable then, right?
And that's a good point, in that we could segment part of it, and maybe I would look at that, based on,
Like almost put it in phases and be like, okay, phase 2, the
Yeah.
grant, if we receive the grant, maybe.
yeah.
But we, I mean, we don't have $1 million sitting in the 2020 budget for consultants.
What do you have for consulting in the 2020 budget? Do you recall offhand?
I don't recall.
You don't.
I think you guys had this committed to memory.
We should have it.
By
I
January.
tried
It's almost
somewhere.
December, yeah, you know.
I feel like it was multiple $100,000. We absolutely anticipated some level of consulting needs that we felt would need to be matched, for sure. But, you know, we would not have anticipated a full $1 million of our dollars going in.
Yeah, I remember the forecast was with the grant proceeds in there as well.
Yes.
Right.
Well, I mean, like the survey work you can do up front, right? That's a relatively small amount of dollars.
So the 2019 had 304,000 of consultants. So now we significantly increased it for 2020.
Yeah.
Proposed budget. Let's see here. Consulting fees, it was 507,000 was what was put in the budget. So the hope is that maybe if we were successful in receiving those grants, that the remaining 500,000 would
Yeah.
come from the grants.
The hope would actually be that more would come from the grants. Because realistically, that's to cover the whole year and a lot of different pieces, just to make
Right, but I
that
think
clear.
the timing will be that we may not be able, if we're needing to move forward, we might
It
not
could,
get the grants.
it could, if we, especially if, and I need to take a look at this, if we segmented this into the 3 areas, and it's possible that notice on that grant could be in the first quarter. So it is possible to cover it.
Thank you. Joe, do you have other questions or suggestions? Comments or anything? Okay, so, actually in our board packet, here it is, resolution 16-2019.
I'll move that we authorize the CEO to execute the necessary documents to retain Farland Johnson and provide the engineering services at a cost not to exceed $1,019,680.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Tony, returning to you for the fourth quarter, how it has been
Okay.
going and how it looks like it's gonna.
Okay, thank you, Chairperson Sims. What we're going to be doing is covering the 10 months, January, October 2019 versus 2018. And we'll cover the numbers overall and then delve into the specific major commodity and product markets. Last year, 2018, the 10 months, we handled 63 ships and barges. This year, 23, a reduction of 40 or 63%. The tonnage was around 280,000 last year and 156,000 this year, down around 125,000 or 44%. That's the overall look. Now, looking into specific product or market areas, heavy lift project cargo, needless to say, are an important part of our product mix. Last year, 45 ships and barges. This year, 10, down 35 or 78%. Now, minus 35. We're down 40. So that's almost 70 or 80% of the overall reduction that we've seen. And I've mentioned in previous board meetings that last year we handled 2 major projects. This year we anticipated another 2, but what happened is one of them was involved in litigation, and that litigation was recently resolved. And the indication is recently that that project will take place in the fourth quarter of next year. There's the other major project that we anticipated fourth quarter this year has been moved back to the second quarter. Bill covered some of those a little later in his comments. Then we had mentioned that there is a vessel on the ocean that departed China and is due with 2 transformers and 30 affiliated truckloads of product. Its ETA arrival here of December 28th. She is arriving into Long Beach. Next call will be Houston, then Lake Charles, then Savannah, and then the Port of Albany. So we may see that vessel this year or next year. That same logistics company that we've been working with is saying that they will have another project similar to this one taking place second quarter next year. That same logistics company, we're working on a export shipment to Brazil. So those are some of the areas we're working on for the heavy lift project cargo area. Another major one is scrap steel. Last year 8 ships, this year 3, down 5 or 63%. Tonnage was 182,000, this year 85,000, down 95,000 or 53%. Well, last month I mentioned that we did not anticipate another scrap vessel before the end of the year. Well, we were very fortunate. 2 weeks ago, we did have a scrap export vessel. Now,
Are the
scrap-
prices starting to go up, or are the prices starting to go up?
I think it's just a matter of somebody decided to sell at a low price, because inventory looked pretty heavy. Now, scrap is certainly associated with the world steel market, and the world steel market is described as being in a severe state, and a few of the indications are Tata Steel, a large steel company based in India, has announced layoffs of 3,000 people, primarily in Europe and some in the United States. And they attributed that to the fact that merger wasn't okay between them and ThyssenKrupp. Now, that's interesting because British Steel, another major steel company in Europe, recently received a 1.2 billion euro, 1.3 billion US dollar influx from the Chinese steel company Jingyi. So the Chinese are propping up that part of that overall situation. So although we are not involved in the overall steel market, ports like Philadelphia, who are heavily involved in steel, struggling. New Orleans, big steel port in the Gulf, they're struggling. What does the future look like? I mentioned it a couple of months ago, uncertainty. Moving on to the forest products or wood pulp. Last year we handled 8, this year 9, up 1 or 13%. We did pick up a new account last year, which has helped increase our total tonnage from last year around 41,000 tons, this year around 56,000, up around 15. And Bill will cover that, the forest products market, more in depth. And was mentioned, we attended the Break Bulk Conference in Houston. The new barge ro-ro ramp was a major factor or feature that we were discussing, and we said that we would focus on the two markets. One, of course, the international, and the other, the domestic market. So while we were down there, touched base with 2 Gulf Coast barge companies, discussing with them, and the next step is to talk to some South Atlantic barge operators. That's right now it's a pretty slim market in a respect. The only one I'm familiar with, of course, we've worked on from a number of times, is Mitsubishi Hitachi out of Lake Mary, Florida. They have a plant in Brunswick, Georgia. We've helped them quote and everything, but they never got the contract, or there was no actual movement. And let's see.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but did you see the AAPA and their shifting trades is having a highlight on ro-ro operation?
Yeah. What's happening is the ro-ro is in that article. I don't know if I saw that one, but the ro-ro carriers are trying to move into the heavy lift project cargo arena very heavily, and so are the container carriers. So they're trying to pick off a lot of our stuff. And then we have next month, looks like 5 ships and barges.
Oh, that's great.
That'll be an entree to Bill Ring.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, it's been a little bit of a slow go, obviously, as Tony has mentioned over the last, sure, a couple meetings, I haven't been here. But we have a nice little boost, it looks like, coming into December. As he mentioned, we had a scrap ship 2 weeks ago. Talk is there could be another one before the year is out, maybe right after Thanksgiving. We're looking at 2 wood pulp vessels, which would be about 10,000 ton of wood pulp in December. 2 project ships, and that's if the one Tony mentioned holds for the end of the year, which would be nice, and a couple of heavy lift barges outbound. So I'll have a nice little boost for the end. We've been living off pulp, which has been a good thing, between the 2 customers we have now, which is, putting us up in an overall total of about 90,000 ton annually between the 2 customers, and it's we're averaging 6,000 to 8,000 ton a month on deliveries, so that's what's kind of keeping us going right now. Going forward, hopefully I'll have some more definitive answers maybe for the December meeting, but we're chasing 3 rather large import projects for next year, a couple of which Tony mentioned. The wood pulp should remain the same. Our one wood pulp customer is still looking at us for lumber, bringing in lumber for next year. So we don't have any details yet, but we're still on the board for that. So that's a good thing, and that could be significant volume and good use for the new warehouse once it's up. So, scrap up in the air. Our calcium customer is talking another shipment for next year, so we'll try and nail that down, which would be helpful. And whatever else comes across the board. Business will be about the same, the way it looks that we saw this year, so unfortunately nothing too exciting, but at least something. There'll be some movement, some export. And we'll keep seeing what's out there and chasing more stuff down. A little bit of brighter light for next year, especially on the project side, which is really good for revenue and man hours. When we get those large projects.
Any questions for Tony or Bill? Thank you both. Is there any other business? All right, there's nothing for executive session. So our next meeting is December 18th. We have a governance committee, audit committee at 10:30 with the board meeting starting at 11.
Yes.
With that, I take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second? All in favor?